Welcome to this week's episode of the Good Luck Club podcast. My guest today is entrepreneur Bernard Moon, co-founder at Sparklabs Group. Bernard, welcome.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks for having me on.
I wonder if you could start off by kindly telling my audience a little bit about you.
Sure. I'm a co-founder and partner at Sparklabs Group, which we describe as a network of startup accelerators and venture capital funds. We're relatively young for being in the VC space. We launched over 7 years ago, but now we have 10 startup accelerators globally and 3 venture capital funds that invest. Now I've invested in over 280 companies across 6 continents.
Wow, that's quite a resume. 208 companies. Impressive. Well, Bernard, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you think success means to you.
Success. Well, I would say on a personal level, I just generally think success is making a positive impact beyond your immediate scope and network. I believe you're a successful person if you help create change within your community and the people around you. Probably in a professional framework, I've never been really a person to keep count or compare, but for Sparklabs or like a VC firm, I think you have to do some of this, right? Because that's how institutions sort of see you and measure you, and how you raise capital as a VC or an entrepreneur. So you do have to sort of think about certain benchmarks, related to those definitions. So.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Within the investment industry, ultimately, if you're not making a return, you can't survive, right?
That's right.
People won't give you more money if you're not making them money. So it's.
Yeah, there's definitely pressure there. I mean, we even joke around as a young firm because we haven't had many big exits yet. We call ourselves a paper tiger because on paper, some of our funds, the return profile is excellent, but institutional investors are looking for realized returns, right? So we're pretty transparent, and the culture is pretty blunt with each other. So we joke around, we're like, oh yeah, we're a paper tiger. People think we're successful, but we're really not until we have exits.
It's so refreshing to have such an honest overview on things of someone's business, and some people would see paper tiger as an insult, but I like the way you kind of embrace it. And it's also interesting, I guess, coming at it, and I know we'll get into your history as an entrepreneur as well, but I think it's interesting coming at it from the perspective of a lot of the companies you invest in, they're also not profitable for the longest of times, right? They're investing and growing and investing. So, it's interesting that the VC world is less inclined to operate that way, although that's exactly what they invest in every day, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. Well, it depends on the space, but you're right. Generally, they're not generating significant revenue until a certain point, right? In their development, at the seed and even Series A, they're still developing their product, finding their product market fit. Hopefully by their B and C rounds, they have good revenue traction, right? Unless you're, maybe 10 plus years ago, if it was a consumer facing app, then you might not see significant revenue until your C and D rounds, right? So.
Well, you could argue that as an investment business, you're 7 years old, perhaps significant return shouldn't come until fund B, C, or D, right?
That's right.
You could argue the same ethos. So, 208 companies. I mean, just a couple of those becoming
280.
280. Wow. See, it's Zoom sound letting us down. 280. That's just a phenomenal amount of businesses. The due diligence alone on all of that must have been a job and a half. But just a couple of those exiting will would make instantly turn it from a paper tiger into a real tiger.
That's right. We're just patiently waiting. I mean, we've had some smaller exits, but I think nothing to sort of harp about yet. And we always sort of benchmark ourselves because we're mainly seed investors. So seed definitely is a longer horizon than even Series A, right? Just to give a comparable, if you think about it, Y Combinator didn't have their first big exit until Dropbox went IPO 12 years later. right? So if you think about it, like really early stage investors, it definitely is more risky even than a Series A fund, and the time horizon is longer. So
I know a lot of my listeners often reach out and ask about how to raise money, and of course people will always throw around angel investors or early stage like you investors. What do you look for when you're investing, for my audience to understand? How do you make a decision? I guess there's probably a short answer and a long answer, but is there a gut instinct there, or is it all about the data?
Well, I mean, it's a combination again. Well, there's three categories I think most VCs and investors they look at. They look at the team, the market, and the product, right? The market answer is probably the easiest always. Like, is this, is the market big enough that person is going for, right? Most of the startups that come to you, they, you assume that's true, or you find out that's true. And then you go to the product, right? Whether it's consumer or enterprise, can you really see yourself or companies using this product? And then you assess the team, whether it's the right sort of combination of business and technical founders, and who are the early employees that they already have on board. Especially at the seed stage, definitely there's a more emphasis on the team, right? Because you assume that that company will go through at least one change of business model or pivot, right? So how are they able to handle that adversity, right? And are they stubborn enough to stay with their vision, but flexible enough to pivot when needed, right? Because these are sort of soft skills. And then you really also have to check in terms of the team chemistry, because I think that's the hardest part, is that, you could say 30-40% of startup failure, is really the founder dynamics, right? They could have the best technology, but there's always a breakdown of founders and team members, and that leads to startup failure. So.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think a lot of people just assume businesses fail because of cash flow or idea didn't work. I've seen different stats thrown around, but I saw a stat saying 9 out of 10 businesses fail because the co-founders fall out with each other, which is an argument for single co-founders, but then it's very lonely, right? So in your opinion, do you think it's good to have a co-founder? Again, thinking about my listeners, if they're thinking of starting a business, do you see any sort of correlation between success, single co-founder, success, two founders?
Yeah, I think there's been prior research done on that. When you jump from single to two, the success of a startup exponentially increases, right? And then I think there's a slight increase to 3, and then it flatlines at 4 or something. So that's why you'll see even Y Combinator or us, our accelerators, we rarely accept single founders, right? Y Combinator, they've been public about it. They say that they look at companies with at least 2 co-founders. And even a lot of investors will say that. There's various reasons, not just the data, historical data that's already there, but, you want, someone equal, right, to challenge your ideas, make you better, sort of sharpen your thinking, right? And doing a startup, you'll definitely go through a lot of ups and downs and a lot of pains. And if you're by yourself, it's just really difficult, right? So you need at least that 1 or 2 other person that has an equal voice with you. You don't want to be, the danger also of, I think, being a single founder is that you have no one to really check you, right? Because I think there's always a temptation with, a large percentage of the people that are in such leadership positions that they'll just surround themselves or create a culture where they're dominant, or they have a bunch of yes people around them, right? And that's just going to lead to failure anyway.
So having someone that can challenge you, I guess, is probably key. So I always talk about your life partner being an important element of any startup too, because that person can also check you and challenge you, right? So I always, in investments I made, I always like to meet the actual partners of the people that are running the businesses.
Yeah, I think that's good. That definitely would be a good check if it was a single founder, right? Who's around them.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, I want to talk a bit about your history and how you ended up doing what you're doing today. I mean, of course, I was looking at your LinkedIn and looking back to 2004. Some of my listeners are quite young, so they're suddenly going to realise that you're older than 20 because you've got a young-sounding voice. But do you think look back at 2004 when you were working, you started as a co-founder in your first business? How did that happen? I always like people to understand the journey of someone like you. So it sounds like when I look at LinkedIn, you're straight into being a co-founder. What were you doing just before that, and how did you end up starting your own business?
Actually, the first startup I did was in '99.
Now you are showing your age to the audience.
Yeah. So it was during the first internet boom, and so my initial career path and interest was in public policy. So when I was at Columbia in New York, 96, 98, that was during the first internet boom. And, believe it or not, it was actually crazier than a few years ago when like everyone and their grandmother wanted to do a startup. And so during my second year in graduate school, I had, even though I was in public service and public policy, I had two different groups of friends ask me to join their startup. Part of the reason why is I think they knew that my parents were entrepreneurs, and I actually helped out with some of their businesses. And so my friends in investment banking and consulting, they started bouncing ideas off me. And then towards the end of my second year, when I was graduating, I decided to join one startup and launch it with my two co-founders, Jimmy and Peter. So that's how I diverged from my original career path. And since then, I just found out, even from that first experience, that I love the chaos of starting a new company, from concept on a napkin to launching a new product and service. And so I just sort of fell in love with that sort of, the energy and the excitement of an early stage company. And I just sort of stayed with it since.
And I'm just looking again at your history. Did you ever actually work for anyone else?
I did. Initially, after undergrad, I worked in government for the governor of Illinois. And then I did a postgraduate fellowship for public service called the Coro Fellowship. And then I went to graduate school, and then I just jumped into the whole startup world. I mean, in between, since then, I had stints in finance. I was at a boutique investment bank and then a family office. And then I went back to the startup world and then launched Sparklabs in 2013. Well, Sparklabs Korea 2012, and then everything else Sparklabs 2013. So.
Interesting. Yeah, I think. I was looking at some of the companies you started. In 2008, you did Open Web Asia. Sounds like. Oh
yeah, that was a conference that we did with different sort of tech people within Asia. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's fascinating, I guess. I always think about what the audience can learn from the process. I mean, did your parents? They were both entrepreneurs, which I think is a fascinating point. But do you think entrepreneurs are born or bred, and do you think your parents influenced you to go one way or the other in the early years?
I believe it's both. I think the research states that more entrepreneurs are sort of born by influence from their parents like me. So I think I didn't feel discomfort in starting a new company when my friends asked me to, right? Even though I wasn't in the field of business, when they asked me, when they're bouncing off ideas, I think it sort of just came naturally because my parents actually even bounce off ideas with me, and I would help them write some of their business plans. So I felt like it was sort of like a natural process when I launched my first startup. So they started various retail businesses. The last one was actually a coffee chain in South Korea. They grew it to 12 stores, and then they sold that. So my second official job was actually my first startup that I mentioned after graduate school, called View Plus. It was a video on demand startup that I did with my co-founders, Jimmy and Peter. But citing the other side, I look at my wife, who's doing a startup now. And my wife, Christine, she was always a big company person, and she liked structure. So she started her career in investment banking at Morgan Stanley. Then in 2004, that's how we first moved to the Bay Area, she joined Google. So she was there for 9 years. She went to Dropbox, but she joined Dropbox when it was already a unicorn. And then she did she joined earlier and earlier startups. And a year ago, she decided, hey, I'm going to start my own company. And she co-founded autonomous driving startup for mass transit called Blue Space. So for her, I think it was by osmosis, by living in Silicon Valley, by seeing other people starting companies and creating their future. I think she finally felt comfortable with the idea of starting her own company. But if you were to ask me like 3 years ago, hey, would Christine ever start a startup? I would be like, no way, zero chance. But so it's interesting to see, like, now she started her own company. It's in a very difficult and competitive space, autonomous driving. So
very hot space as well. I think that's big future. It's interesting what you're saying. There's a few things I want the audience to pick up on. I mean, first of all, I always feel like this concept of like a leopard never changed its spots. It's absolutely not true. People do change, and you can say evolve or devolve, depending how you look at it. But if someone 3 years ago had asked you with your wife to do a startup, you would have said 100% no. And now look. And I think that's true. As part of what I'm also trying to get out there to folks out there that perhaps thought they were going to go get a job and so on, you can start a business of your own. My view on what you've just described there is that your wife has built up her risk muscle. She's got, as you say, she's gone further and further down the food chain into the earlier and earlier stages of a business, got comfortable with it and realized that's probably where the excitement is, and now has the risk appetite to start something of her own, which I think is a process, right? I mean, you're lucky, and so was I for that matter, born into entrepreneurial families, right? That gave us that feeling early on. But your parents, did they have any failures? Did you ever remember? Because my parents at one point, they wanted me to be a lawyer. They did not want me to be a lawyer, an entrepreneur in a way, because they saw it as risky. Did you ever have that twinge at points in your younger life?
Yeah, I saw them fail a couple of businesses in between, right? But I don't know if I really thought deeply about it, right? Because they didn't really, they stressed out about it, but then they said, oh, we're just going to do our next one, right? So I think failure was acceptable, right? And that was a process. And that's sort of interesting because they came from, they're Korean American, but, they immigrated from Korea, which is a more conservative society, right? And they're definitely unique because they never pressured me versus other Korean or I guess typical immigrant families in the U.S. or Asian American immigrant families were like, oh, you have to be a doctor or something, right? Right. So they didn't really pressure me, on that front.
Do you think your education helped you? I mean, it sounds like that's where you got your initial co-founder network from. But
my education, I don't think it directly helped me. I mean, my co-founder network. Well, I went to Wisconsin, but my friend at Northwestern introduced me to my co-founder, Jimmy, our freshman year. And that's how eventually, several years later, we got together and launched our first startup. I think where I got comfortable was actually when I did this postgraduate program called the Coro Fellowship. Right? It's sort of a training ground for people that are interested in public service. There's a fair amount of alumni that are actual U.S. congressmen and senators. But it was an interesting program, and I still say it's actually the second best career experience I had after my first startup. Because the premise is that they threw you in a lot of uncertain situations, right? Like you didn't know what the assignment was for that week until Monday morning. and they would be like, you have a meeting with the mayor of St. Louis, go, right? And you'll find out your directions there. So they constantly threw you in uncomfortable situations. And I think that was actually a great training ground, not just for public service, but for actually business. So then when I did my first startup, it's all about uncertainty, right? It's about also a lot of taking a lot of acceptable risk, right? I remember even, we think of it crazy now, but like Jimmy and I remember one night we were like, filling out like 10 credit card forms online, right? Like trying to rack up our credit card debt initially to get our product built, right? So we took this risk, and it was actually a lot of enormous risk for, being in our 20s, but, it was acceptable in our mind for some reason.
Well, and looking again at your career history, it seems like when I look, it's 2010 you started doing XS Group, and 2011 you did VidQuick, and then 2012 was when Sparklabs seemed to fully come to life. I mean, I always say to people you can't do more than one thing at once, but looks like there you're doing quite a few things at once. What's your experience through that journey? What was going on there?
Yeah, I think we try to launch XS Group, right? That was actually a startup that I was launching with two other co-founders, right? And they're actually, I think, because we were more sort of experienced, we had a set goal in mind of what we needed to raise, right? Because some people think, sometimes you could raise too much money, right? There's also a problem of raising too little capital, what I call funding to fail, right? And we knew to play within that luxury goods space, we needed a minimum of $3 million to launch, right? And we got commitments of $2 million, but since we couldn't hit that we actually didn't launch the company, right? So I think experience sort of taught us, hey, if we took this $2 million, it's going to end in zero a year from now. So, I think because I was with also two other experienced entrepreneurs, we decided not to move forward.
And so that didn't reach its funding goal. And so, I mean, then it was quick, you moved to something else. Is that kind of how it flowed? So you're like, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Then we went to another startup with Quick, and then we launched Sparklabs. And then I went full-time on Sparklabs in end of 2013.
And it's interesting the way you describe it. It feels almost clinical, but there must have been a lot of emotion during those moments where, you have this idea. Again, I'm thinking about my audience. People have an idea. They can't raise the money. It feels like you made quite a logical decision. We didn't raise the money, so I'll just do this next thing. Is it that logical, or was there a lot of emotion?
There was some emotion involved, but I think, as I mentioned, since we were more experienced entrepreneurs, we sort of had set goals and metrics in mind in terms of what we needed to launch. And so it was almost like a clinical decision to a certain degree, right? An investor offered us $2 million. We're like, oh, great, but we need $3 million. So we went around trying to get $3 million. We couldn't hit that metric. So we said, okay, let's just move on.
I think that's
of course, I think if we were younger in our mid-20s, we would have taken that $2 million. Right? We'd be like, oh yeah, let's try to hit it. We'll do it, right? But I remember actually talking to another founder within that space, and they raised, a similar amount, like $2 million, and I was like, I don't think it's going to work out, right? And it didn't. Like, just because we knew sort of the numbers on that front.
I think there's a learning there for listeners, a big one, and I feel like a lot of people here in startup world, you see that graphic where someone digging away and the gold or the whatever is just so close, right? And they're digging away and then they give up, and just as they were about to reach the gold, it's this one of the favorite graphics that seems to fly around with anyone that's hashtag startup world, right? It's that kind of persistence thing, which I also talk about a lot. But there's something in what you're saying which is really, I think, quite important for people to pick up on, which is you kind of set yourself a red line, right? Like that, if we get X, then we'll carry on. If we don't, then we'll move on. But that's serious discipline. Because like you say, I mean, 2 million, my mindset, even today, after all the companies I've done, my mindset goes to, well, let's take the 2 million, get it as far as we can, and I'm sure we'll raise the other million over the next 12 months runway, you know? Or is it just a capital cost of excess that you just knew you needed the whole amount?
Yeah, we knew that we needed the whole amount, or it would be sort of a cash flow issue also, right, within that space. So I think it's good that we were disciplined. And it's funny because it's like, it reminds me now, since you're talking about this topic, even before I actually started doing startups, you know, my dad would sometimes like talk about his philosophy and stuff, right? And he'd be like, hey, business is like poker. You have to know when to fold, right? And a lot of people don't know when to fold, right? So you just have to know when is the right time and move on, right? And like poker, it's not an emotional decision.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Yeah, and I think for a lot of people, and I would like put myself in this category, I have not known when to fold, and sometimes I'm glad I didn't, because the person holding the hand opposite me doesn't have what I thought, you know. So it's an interesting analogy actually, and and I think that your way of thinking is really quite intellectual about building something which I think is quite emotional. And so when you're looking at startups to invest in now, do you take this into consideration? Is it we'll give you the money if you raise all of the round, or is it really a founder-led decision on that point?
Yeah, I think not founder-led, but I think it depends on the founder and how comfortable we feel. I mean, but you know, I think most investors, they're not going to put in their money until, you know, the stated minimum target that founder is trying to reach, right, is raised. But in terms of my own experiences, I do think I probably push that aside a little bit, right? Because you do want to see, you know, more of that sort of, you know, hustler mentality, can do, et cetera, in the people that you invest in, right? So it is a delicate balance, though, because you want someone that's driven and stubborn, like I mentioned, but, you know, the discipline to pivot and know when to sort of change course. Right? So that's the balance, you know, that you try to find in entrepreneurs that you invest in.
I can hear my listeners already saying they want to hear more about XS and what it was all about, and I perhaps have you back on the show going into the details of some of these business learnings, but I wanted to get your story down a little bit more today. So in the last 5 minutes I've got with you, I guess I wanted to get a little bit more into you, finally, you know, your bit. So we talked a little bit about education, and I always have this thing about education where I'm nervous that people are going to get university degrees and then they get trapped in that training and in the debt that then brings on them and doesn't allow them to start a business. Do you think that's true or not?
I mean, in terms of what, I mean, whether a university degree is necessary, or I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
Yeah, no, I mean, my basic point is, do you think education, when you're looking at all these startups, you've got a huge sample size there of 280 companies. Do you think education is an important thing or not? Do you feel like, a bit like having two co-founders increases the odds of success? Do you think having gone to Stanford or Harvard, because again, there's a lot of investment companies that will only invest in people that have come from Harvard, right? Or only invest in people that have come from these prestigious schools. Do you think that's important or not?
Us as a firm, I would say we don't look at that as a primary factor, right? I think we more look at, you know, the founders in terms of what they did right before and how the team sort of gels together and works together. I will say there are firms out there, like you mentioned, yeah, they do look at if it's like Stanford engineer or worked at Google or certain sort of signals like that. I think since we're invest globally, I don't think we look at the pedigrees, especially from sort of U.S. universities. So yeah, then you have to sort of dig a little deeper and do, I think, a little more due diligence, right, in terms of the personality of the founders and their background and doing reference checks. But I think that's all more necessary and important too, right? Because going also into my personal experience, right? Like I could say that some people looked awesome on paper, and this is like for any job, right? In a corporate job or whatever, you're hiring someone, right? This person is like, Harvard grad, undergrad, HBS, right? Shining star at Bain or BCG or McKinsey or whatever, right? When you get them into the startup world, I think it's a whole nother story, right? Or when they're at, they work at Google, but then when they're in a stressful environment, I say when that stress is on you and there's fires to put out, true character comes out, right? And I've seen it where, not just from my own experience, but even in our portfolio companies, they hire, someone with a great resume, great actually even reference checks. But when they're in that startup environment, like you see a whole other side of that person, right? Right. And that's the same thing, like even in sports, like I play basketball. I say like sometimes you don't see a person's true character come out until they're on the basketball court. And that's when you find out, oh, that person that you thought was so nice and gentle is actually a jerk.
Totally. That's why I always tell people to work with their partners at least once in their life, Then you'll see what someone's really like when you work with them. It's quite hard for people to hide that in those spontaneous moments of frustration. So you'll get to know what they're really like, their moral code and so on. So it's
true.
Fascinating. Do you just briefly, because I know I'm running out of time with you now, but do you believe luck plays a big role in the success of a business, or what's your view on the element of luck that is this podcast's theme?
Yes, I do so. And then there's actually, it reminds me of a funny comment that my co-founder Jimmy Kim, who I did my first 2 startups with, and we did Sparklabs together, he always says, like, very commonly, he's like, better to be lucky than smart, right?
Right.
Right. And I do think for me, like luck or chance or grace or whatever you call it has always played a role in my career. And some people say that you create your own luck, but I think if you think about the mechanics, I mean, majority of startup founders, they're hustlers. Many are brilliant, right? So, one example is like that lucky meeting or chance encounter that you get at a conference, right? You go through hundreds of random people, and that one meeting could lead to that big break for your company, right? And I think that's more luck. I don't think that's a creation of intelligence or more work. Right. So for me, I would say the lucky break was meeting my co-founder, Jimmy, like during our first year in college. And then several years later, we would join up to do our first 2 startups together. And then in 2012, meeting to co-found Sparklabs Korea. Right. So I would give luck more weight than a lot of things.
I can hear the community around this subject kind of throwing back the whole debate is, well, they went to that conference, so they created their own luck. But of course, there's plenty of people that went to that conference that didn't meet that person that gave them that opportunity, right? So it's a fascinating subject. Of course, it could also argue you can't control where you're born. That is definite random luck. You're born into an entrepreneurial family that allowed you to take risk, encouraged it even. So, these are all elements of luck that were definitely initially out of your control, right? You did not decide who you were going to be born into, what family you were going to be born into. Although my wife always says that our son chose us. He looked down and said, I'm going to have those 2, please. They're going to give me a good life. So we always thank him. We always thank him for choosing us. But look, fascinating to talk to you. I'd love to have you back on, actually, because I feel like it's gone super quick and I haven't got half the bits and pieces I wanted to get from you. So I'd love to have you come back on and talk a little bit more about your experience, talk a little bit more about Sparklabs process and more about your experiences. And so love to have you back if you're up for that.
Sure, we'd love to. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks. And I'd just like to end it with a lighthearted question, or there's lots of other things I'd like to ask, but just if you went back to the younger you and gave some advice, out of interest, how old are you and what would the advice be?
Oh, how old am I? I'm 49. So if I were to go back to, I don't know if you asked that. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Now the audience knows you're young. You're young, 49 years old. But I mean, what age were you? If you went back and you said to your 8-year-old self, or you went back and you said to your 18-year-old self, which age is a good age to go back, and what would you say?
I'd probably go back to like 22. right? Right when I'm graduating from college. The advice there would be just to appreciate the people around you more, right? From friends to acquaintances to strangers, right? Because I think it's easy, to appreciate your friends and family, definitely even the acquaintances and strangers, right? I think that would, I think I've been definitely more sort of valued in my life. Yeah. And then I think on a practical note, probably going back to like a decade later in my life, at certain points in my career, I probably would have taken less risk and not doing a startup, especially when our first kids were born, so I wouldn't create so much stress with my wife.
Interesting. I have a similar experience. I know what you mean. I'm just writing it down. I don't want to forget that. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm going to sum up some of the things I've taken away from our chat today. It's a lot of really interesting things, Bernard. So thank you. But here's my quick takeaway. I think this concept of knowing when to fold is really quite powerful. So your father passed that bit of knowledge to you, and now we're passing it hopefully on to 50,000 people that are listening. I think knowing when to fold is a really interesting part of the technique of being a successful entrepreneur. And I think it takes a lot of guts to fold, even if you've got a good hand. And so it's a really interesting example, I think. I love what you were saying earlier in the podcast about creating change, being a measure of success, making an impact, being a measure of success. I think it's also interesting how sometimes the dynamic, as you've mentioned, about the finances come into play in everybody's businesses. And I think it's kind of naive to think that money isn't an important part of making any business work. But I think, in each industry, there's different measures of success. And I definitely think with the startup world, the measure should be the impact, and hopefully money follows because you're making an impact. That whole clients need you, clients want you, and so you'll make money somehow. But I think that's really interesting. I think the the whole idea of my feeling, this funding to fail point that you've mentioned, that a lot of people, I think today I see it. There's all this talk about how you shouldn't raise too much money. And be careful. But you actually don't hear that often, you're not raising enough, which is weird. Because it's actually something that should be the forefront of, have you raised enough? Good. I think right now, I was in an investor call recently and someone said to the founder, the number one thing right now is if you've got money in the bank, you're likely to survive. And if you haven't, you're finished. Doesn't matter what your idea is, what your team is, like that kind of mindset, the money, solves all problems, kind of the Google mantra, right? Yeah. So funding, making sure you're not funding to fail, making sure you're going for the full amount you need is a good bit of advice. And so, and I think, finally, I love, and I think this is going to be the T-shirt we're going to make around this podcast, which is appreciate people more. I think that's something I can also relate to. I think it's sometimes in startup world, we just go, we build, we work. And, I don't tell my wife enough that I love her. And I think this is important to sometimes pause and realize, the people around you are important. And it's all well and good building a wonderful company. That's important and often is very important to, making the world a better place. But just appreciating people. So I think that's a nice message to end our podcast on. And so, Bernard, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great.
Thank you so much for listening today, folks. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. We appreciate that you have so many podcasts that you could be listening to. If there's anything we can do to improve our podcast, make the content better for you, allow you to receive it in a format that you like, feel free to reach out and let us know. If any of Bernard's comments today struck a chord or you'd like to know more about his business and his life, we put all the links in the comments section on whatever format you're listening to this podcast on today. We appreciate you taking the time to listen to us. If you found it useful, please share it, please like it, and feel free to comment. We always reply to comments, we always appreciate feedback, and we thank you for taking the time to listen to us today.